Welcome to the Vaccination Station. My name is Dave, and today I'm speaking with Diane Windsor. Diane, thank you for joining me.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Let's start by getting to know you. Tell me 3 things about yourself that you think the audience would find interesting.
You know, I've tried to prepare for this because I've listened to some of your other podcast episodes, and of course I didn't, so now I have to wing it. But I do have a small publishing company called Motina Books, and my little tagline is we publish books by mothers and for mothers, and that's something that I love to do. I love the whole process of editing and formatting and everything and getting the message out into the world. Another thing I love to do, I am a sourdough bread baker. And I am not a COVID sourdough baker. I started doing this about 3 years ago. So, and I was actually inspired by an Australian woman named Ellie. I'm not sure of her last name, but her page is Ellie's Everyday. And yeah, I think we're just going to have to stick with 2. Those are probably the 2 interesting things about me.
Well, that's great. I'm a big sourdough fan. I really love sourdough bread.
Cool.
And when it's well done, it's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah,
it's very satisfying, you know, to build your starter from scratch and then just, you know, 3 little ingredients, flour, salt, and water, and that's it. And you get this beautiful loaf of bread that is so delicious with nothing extra added. So it's a lot of fun.
So let's talk about your personal story, because there's really 2 aspects to this interview. There's your personal story, and then there's the book you've written, which was largely inspired by your experience. Which one would you like to start with?
Well, let's start with our cancer story, because that is a big part of what inspired the book, and we can talk about that if that's cool.
Sure, let's go right ahead.
Okay, so in 2018, my 20-year-old son was diagnosed with leukemia. And I live in Texas. He was living in Minnesota at the time because he's an independent guy and he didn't want to live at home with mom and dad anymore. So he went up to Minnesota and he was doing well. He was kind of going to school part-time, but he was more working, living his life, enjoying himself. And in June of 2018, we had been talking on the phone and he told me that he wasn't feeling very well. And of course I'm thinking, okay, he's partying a little too much. He just needs to pull himself together and get off the couch and go to work. But he went to the clinic and they did a blood test and they said, I think you have leukemia or lymphoma. And he called me right away, and I have to tell you, I was not happy. I was pissed off at the doctor because I thought, how can he tell my son this information just based on a blood test? You know, he must certainly need more testing done before it's determined that he's got some kind of cancer. That's ridiculous. But now that we know, you know, the normal number of white blood cells per microliter is around 10 or 12,000. And his number was 300,000. And so that was like through the roof and could only indicate some form of blood cancer. So it took a long time to go through treatment. The frontline treatment for leukemia, and this was a pediatric cancer, even though my son was 20 years old and technically an adult, he was treated at a children's hospital with a pediatric protocol. And my understanding is that they did that because a younger person, a younger body could handle a pediatric protocol, like more chemo, better than an older person, like somebody in their 50s or 60s could. So we had to spend some time up in Minnesota because he wasn't stable enough to be moved back to Texas. I wanted to move him right away, and they said no. But eventually we got him back home. A lot of chemo, a lot of steroids. It seemed to be working. They did periodic bone marrow biopsies, and we got down to like 0.5% of leukemia cells in his bone marrow, which sounds like that's not bad at all. But in order to be considered in remission, there can be no evidence of disease in the bone marrow at all. So basically, it turned out that the chemotherapy was not going to work for him. So it was time to move on to plan B. Now, when a person goes through chemotherapy, and I'm sure a lot of people understand this, it wipes out everything. It destroys your bone marrow, which produces your blood cells, red cells, white cells, platelets. And so he needed to have a lot of transfusions throughout this process because his body wasn't producing the blood products that he needed. So they needed to be transfused into his system. And along with his bone marrow, all of his antibodies to any disease that he's ever had or been vaccinated against is also wiped out. He's really compromised and at risk for any kind of, illness, basically. So you have to be really careful. I mean, even if somebody has a cold, you don't want a person with this kind of immune system exposed to a cold. So chemo didn't work. This was in the fall of 2018 that we found that out. So plan B was actually very cool. It's a new type of immunotherapy that was only recently approved by the FDA in the US, and is called CAR T-cell therapy, chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. So in your bloodstream, one of your it must be the white cells, is a T cell because it's one of the infection fighters. And what they did is they put a catheter into his neck to collect only the T cells. So his blood went out of his body into a centrifuge machine, and they spun it around and spun it around really fast, and they separated only what they wanted to remove and then put the rest back in them. And that was a long process. It took like 5 or 6 hours. And then they sent the T cells to a pharmaceutical company who modified them. And the way they modified them was so that they would only target the leukemia cells once they were put back into his body. And it's really, in some cases, the infusion of these new cells, the CAR T cells, it can potentially cause some side effects that are dangerous, like neurologically, it can cause some problems. There can be, what do they call it? CRS, cytokine release syndrome, which can cause high fevers and dizziness and a lot of nausea and stuff. But in my son's case, he did very well. He stopped taking chemo, of course, because the chemo would destroy the new cells, and you want the new T cells to multiply and attack the leukemia cells. And I remember he told me 3 weeks after infusion, he said, I am starting to feel like myself again. Since the first time since he started treatment for his leukemia. And so that was really cool. And 30 days after infusion, there was no sign of leukemia cells in his bone marrow. So I think CAR T and immunotherapy like this is probably going to be the new frontline treatment of cancer at some point. Right now, I think when he had it, it was only approved for non-solid tumors or blood cancers, but I think that it's in trials for solid tumor treatment.
That is a really extraordinary therapy. I had not heard of that before. So, thank you very much for explaining it in such detail. The idea that they are capable of removing T cells, simply extracting them from the blood, and then modifying them and then putting them back in, that is just utterly mind blowing. But what an extraordinary development. That is really something.
It is pretty amazing to me as well. I was just, when I heard about this, I was like, what is that? And there really isn't too much information available yet, or there wasn't at that time. This was well over a year ago. But it's this immunotherapy stuff is really cool, and it doesn't damage the body the way chemotherapy and radiation do. You know, it doesn't have those. I mean, he was miserable. Anybody's miserable going through chemo, right? If you've ever known anybody battling cancer, and I'll say I've known one or two people before my son, but more at a distance. You know, this is my first real close-up experience with somebody battling cancer. Um, I do know that there have been people who have tried every type of treatment for, let's see, leukemia, and nothing works. And then they tried CAR T and it really was life-saving. There's actually a gentleman in New Zealand named David Downs who is very vocal and a real advocate for this type of therapy. And they didn't offer it in New Zealand when he needed it. And so he paid out of pocket to come to the US and have it and have the treatment. But yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. And there was also a little boy in the UK who needed it, and they raised a lot of money because it wasn't covered by the NHS in the UK at that time, and they came over as well, and he's doing great now. So it's really just an amazing life-saving treatment for a lot of people.
That really is
So
fantastic. Because of course, chemo and radio, although they are effective, they're pretty much just forms of carpet bombing. They, as
yes,
you say, they wipe out everything. So the hope is that you will kill the cancer before you kill the
I
patient,
agree
and
exactly.
that can be a pretty fine knife edge sometimes.
Hmm.
Never mind the lasting damage that it does and the amount of rebuilding the body has to go through after the treatment.
Exactly.
But to be able to do something so specific and targeted without damaging the rest of the body, that is a stunning breakthrough.
Yep.
And yeah, another fantastic piece of science that was not brought to us by anti-vaxxers.
Exactly. And it was brought to us by Big Pharma. I mean, this was Novartis, who was a big pharmaceutical company. And we were very lucky to have decent health insurance. So our health insurance covered it. This was a $500,000 treatment. And I'll tell you, though, that Novartis has a compassionate care fund so that if a patient's insurance is not going to cover it, they would have. So while I understand Big Pharma pulls a lot of crap, like insulin prices and the EpiPen thing, and there's plenty of other examples, I was very pleasantly um, surprised to hear that they would have covered this cancer therapy if my insurance hadn't been able to, or refused to. So
That's actually a very smart move on their part because if they've recently developed this and only just got it approved by the FDA, it makes a lot of sense for them to take what for them is just a small hit on the price of the treatment to gain a huge amount of excellent publicity for
that's
their
true.
product and
Yeah.
treatment. And if they've got sufficient confidence to offer it in that way, having
Right.
been approved by the FDA, must have gone through considerable testing
Of course.
already. So it works out well for them. So yeah, there's definitely a market benefit for them too, but it still runs counter to the idea that big pharma is always lying to us, is always up to some dodgy shenanigans
That's
in the
right.
background and is always hiding cancer cures so that no one can get
That's
cured of cancer,
right.
can only ever be treated endlessly. I mean, this your son was successfully treated with a cure for his cancer. So this kind of narrative
I
falls apart
know
pretty
it
quickly when
does.
it's exposed to the
It
cold
does.
light of
It does.
reality.
Well, but I will say, CAR T does not always last for everybody. They call it a success if those modified T cells stay in the patient's body for a year or longer. And unfortunately, after 3 months, there were signs that they were starting to go away. And Brendan was still in remission. They even called it a deep remission. There was no sign of leukemia cells, but he had B cell leukemia. And the CAR T cells do not discriminate when it comes to the B cells. They're really just going after the B cells. They just want to make sure that they're getting the leukemia cells, which also happen to be B cells. So if there are healthy B cells, they're getting them as well. So Brendan's healthy B cells started coming back. And that was an indication that for whatever reason, the CAR T was not going to work for him long term. But it did get him to a good place for a transplant, because a patient has to be in complete remission in order to have a bone marrow transplant. And bone marrow transplant, stem cell transplant, those terms are pretty much interchangeable. We did not have a good live bone marrow donor match within our family or on the registry. So they used stem cells that came from donated umbilical cords. And he had a stem cell transplant on June 28th of 2019. And so again, of course, he had not had any chemo or radiation or anything while the T cells were there, because they wanted to make sure the T cells were doing their thing and everything. But to prepare for the transplant, full body radiation, lots of chemo, again, to deplete the bone marrow and make room for the new stem cells. And transplants are rough. There are a lot of side effects from all of that radiation and chemo and everything. And it was a 51-day hospital stay, because the patient has to wait for the new cells to engraft. And luckily they did. And we were discharged in August of 2019. And, but there are a lot of precautions that we needed to take once we were discharged. Like, he had to be on like a low bacteria diet. We had to have somebody else watch our dog. There could be no animals or live plants in the home. And there's this magic 100 days post transplant where he can't do any of this stuff. So, but he did well. But again, extremely immunocompromised. He had no immune system left. And I remember he had been discharged, but we still had to go for weekly checkups. They did blood tests, make sure his counts were looking good, make sure he's looking good. And we were driving down to the hospital one day for a clinic checkup and listening to the radio, and they start talking about a measles outbreak in a county in Texas. And he just looked at me and he's like, "Is that close to us?" I'm like, "I'm not sure." And it turned out to be in the Houston area, which is very, very far away from where we are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But still, this is a concern that he has to have. Here he is fighting cancer with no immune system, and he's got to worry about measles outbreaks because people don't trust the safety and efficiency or effectiveness of vaccines these days for some ridiculous reason.
And people forget that a measles outbreak, even if it's in another state, all that means is it's a plane ride away, a
Mm-hmm.
bus ride away, a car day trip away. That's not very
No,
far in real terms. People forget that just because it's a significant distance now, it doesn't mean that it won't be coming to you
exactly.
very soon, within the week, within the day, within the
Right,
next 3 hours or so.
right.
And it's that kind of complacency that allows these diseases to spread beyond their initial breakout areas and then create new clusters elsewhere where people haven't even expected to
Mhm.
see any and never thought that it would come to them. And we've seen that with COVID-19 cropping up with the extra waves, the first wave, second wave coming through certain communities that had previously got a handle on it.
Exactly, exactly. So, we had to be very, very careful. And he's doing well now. He is almost a year and a half post transplant. He is back up in Minneapolis, uh, which is good because he didn't like living in my house, which was fine. He's pretty much a grown man. But there were nurses at the hospital who said that a diagnosis like this is more difficult for a young adult or maybe a teen who's just in high school enjoying their high school or college years or something, because they're living their life. Little kids, they're used to being home with mom and dad, and that's where they expect to be. But the last thing my son wanted was to have to come home and have us take care of him. um,
So So on the issue of the T cells, does this mean his body has to learn how to create those new T cells itself, or what
well,
happens?
because of the transplant, the stem cell transplant, the CAR T stuff was basically wiped out because it wasn't working. But he is still not vaccinated against anything. I remember I asked him like a month ago. I said, because he's still going to clinic once a month for routine blood work. He's got a little bit of graft versus host disease because just like with a solid organ transplant, patients can go through that with a bone marrow transplant, and it's not bad. It's just kind of skin irritation and stuff like that. And he's still taking immunosuppressant pills. So as long as he's taking those pills, that medication, it's to combat against the graft versus host disease, but it also means that it's still suppressing his immune system. And so he can be vaccinated while he's taking those. I had him ask the doctor, ask when you can be vaccinated again, because there was a big measles outbreak in the Minneapolis area not too long ago. And I think, is it religious reasons that people aren't vaccinating up there or something? Or yeah,
I believe
there was a
there was a
group.
bunch of anti-vaxxers who came through and put a big scare into some of the local minority communities.
There's a big
Um,
Somali population up
That's
there.
it.
The
That was it. The
immigrants,
Somali
yeah.
population, yeah. So the anti-vaxxers went through there and convinced a lot of them that the measles vaccine, the MMR, was
Okay.
dangerous and either
That's sounding
potentially
familiar.
life-threatening or could damage the child's fertility and this kind of thing. So that meant that local community leaders suddenly found people avoiding vaccines, and they had to work very hard to try and
Yeah.
rebuild that confidence.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, yes, an outbreak did occur, and it ended up being quite a persistent cluster.
Right. Right. Which is scary to me as a mother. It's because I know that he could be protected against this if he had not had cancer and not had his immune system wiped out and still not taken these pills to suppress his immune system. I would be, he would be vaccinated because he's as pro-vax as I am. He doesn't question it. But unfortunately, he's one of the people that herd immunity should be protecting right now.
Yeah, it's ironic because anti-vaxxers who always love to inflate what they perceive as the dangers of vaccines. They say, "Well, I won't set my child alight to keep yours warm." The implication being, of course, that vaccines are as dangerous as setting your child on fire, which is pure nonsense. But even if the principle of that argument had any merit, it still wouldn't work because, in fact, the opposite is true. By not vaccinating, they are potentially lighting your child on fire because your child has a suppressed immune system and is doubly vulnerable to diseases that he could otherwise fight off
Exactly.
either with the help of a vaccine or if he's lucky enough with a
Yeah,
robust immune system.
exactly. Exactly. Right. And that's interesting. That you mentioned, the potential hazards that these people think that vaccines cause. And they think that vaccines can kill people, but aren't people living longer today than they ever have before in history? And isn't the world population larger than it ever has been? And, it drives me crazy that people think Bill Gates is evil because his foundation has done so much for people in poorer countries by bringing vaccines there and for vaccine research and development. And I mean, their logic just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, this is all very true. For most of human history, the average lifespan has ranged between 30 and 45 years. Now, admittedly, a lot of that is due to the fact that infant mortality rates have been incredibly high, which sort of artificially keeps the lifespan, the average lifespan
Sure.
low. But again, infant mortality is something that can be addressed
Mm-hmm.
with vaccines and other advances in medicine and science. And the only time in history that we've actually started to materially increase the average human lifespan is when we started to develop superior technology, science, and medicine.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't until about the 11th century AD that we began to see a much higher average average lifespan. By the
Okay.
time we reach the 1500s, it's up to about 60, which is a
Mm-hmm.
significant advance. And now, of course, globally today, around in 2020, even accounting for widespread problems across developing nations like war and famine and pestilence and this kind of thing, the average human lifespan is still around 70, 72. And then, of course, in some highly developed countries like Japan, it is insanely high. Average lifespan in Japan is something like 82 to 84, which is
Mm-hmm. And that's average.
extraordinary. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's average,
that's
which
that's
is
amazing.
crazy. In Australia, it's pretty high too. I think we're somewhere between 75 and 78, which is
Mm-hmm.
not bad. But yeah, all of these developments were achieved not by turning our back on science and medicine, but by embracing it
Right.
and and succeeding and developing. And of course, vaccines have played a huge part in all of that.
That's right.
Vaccines have been a huge boon, and vaccines have been massively responsible for a drop in infant mortality rates, for example,
Mm-hmm.
because diseases that would otherwise kill a child at the age of, you know, 12 months, 18 months, or 2 to 5 years can now be vaccinated against and completely prevented. And that's just an extraordinary breakthrough. And where vaccines aren't doing the job, it's advances in medicine and science. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, in hygiene, certainly
Mm-hmm.
advances in hygiene and
Certainly.
sanitation have played a big part, but that is all tied in with science and medicine as well.
Right.
So
Right.
there's nothing really that anti-vaxxers can point to and say, we can take credit for that. Our
That's right.
community did that, or
That that's
our
absolutely
mentality did that. There's
right.
nothing in human history that shows that their approach has actually advanced the human race at all.
Mm-hmm.
And if vaccines were this big killer that they're supposed to be, it's hard to understand why, at a time when more humans are being vaccinated than at any other time in history, our lifespan is just extraordinary. And now people are starting to talk about the potential overpopulation of the planet.
I know. I know. So you brought up a point about infant mortality, and this might be a good segue to talk about my book, because at the end of the book I included a little bit of bonus material, and it's a blog post that was written by a friend of mine, um, whose father, This was back, I want to say in the 20s or 30s, 1920s or 30s, so a good 100 years ago. His older sister died of pertussis when she was 3, and he had pertussis. And so it's a very moving story. She gave me permission to include it in the back of the book, of how her grandmother was in one room with her dying 3-year-old, and then running to the other room to take care of, like, her, I think he was 18 months or 12 months at the time, who was fighting for his life with pertussis. And she titled this this blog post, "Aunt Betty Wasn't Vaccinated." And she talks about how entire families would be lost because it's so incredibly contagious, and it's so devastating to a young child, baby up to toddler age. They often didn't survive, and people don't remember that. People today have no idea what it was like for that kind of thing to happen. And that a lot of times people would have, like, I don't know, this is a crass way of saying it, a second litter of children because their kids died from these diseases that are now preventable, and they would have more children. It's just ridiculous that anti-vaxxers today don't realize that, or don't take that seriously.
No,
So
it's very clear if you visit any graveyard, say in a church that dates from at least the late 19th century, you can see it all there, literally
all the
written in
children,
stone.
exactly.
5 children, 6 children, even
Yeah,
10 children,
yeah.
and then look at the date of birth and the date of
Of
death,
death,
and
yeah,
those lifespans are sickeningly brief.
yeah,
So, yeah, why did people have big families? Because once you accounted for all the infant mortality,
right.
the family didn't end up being that big
That
after all.
big,
They were
exactly.
trying to make sure they had a kid that actually lived beyond its 5th birthday.
Yeah,
And people forget all of this because they haven't seen it for themselves, they haven't witnessed for themselves, and
exactly.
they haven't spoken to people who lived through that. Now, my grandmother, who's dead now, but she lived through the Great Depression, and she saw the impacts of all these
Yeah,
diseases, not just impacting on families that weren't particularly well to do, or families that were struggling to make ends meet, but she saw how they ripped through families of all standings in society,
right.
because
It
you
didn't
know
matter how wealthy they were. The technology
it didn't
wasn't there.
matter.
The
No,
science wasn't
that's
there
right.
yet. Yeah,
Yeah, there were no vaccines, and everyone, even people who had access to good sanitation and good hygiene, it didn't make any difference to diseases that don't care about those things. Measles doesn't care if you live a
correct.
healthy life with top class sanitation and world class hygiene. Doesn't
Right,
care.
right.
It'll rip through your family anyway, and it'll do its
Exactly.
damage. So no, she witnessed all of this kind of stuff, and I have a personal friend in Western Australia. He's Italian, and he caught polio as a child. Who was one of those unfortunate
Mm,
people who lived who was a child just before the
wow.
polio vaccine was developed, and he can walk today, but not without the aid of crutches.
Mm-hmm,
His legs are permanently damaged,
mm-hmm.
and again, you don't see that anymore thanks to vaccines. And as a result,
Exactly.
people have become complacent and
Yes,
convince themselves, well, maybe these diseases weren't that common, or weren't that bad, or the effects weren't so terrible. And people are exaggerating these days. All you have to do is talk to someone born, even in the 40s. And if they
mm-hmm.
hadn't seen it, they would know someone who has, or they would know someone in their family who had been through this sort of
Sure,
stuff.
sure,
But as
exactly.
all of that recedes into the past, thanks to vaccination, of course, vaccines have become the victims of their own success.
Mm-hmm.
People don't have that recent memory of these diseases and the damage that they can cause, or the tragedy that they can inflict on
It's
families.
devastating.
So they just think, this is just how things are, and those diseases can't have been that bad after all.
Right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
if you go to the cemeteries, you will see that.
Hmm. Right.
So let's we've moved on to your book now. So let's back up a bit. Go to the start of your book. Let's talk about the premise of your book, and how that was inspired by your personal journey.
So yeah, I really wanted to get this story written down, and I thought a good way to write about the cancer journey was to fictionalize it and create a young adult novel. And like I said, I've really been passionate about vaccines for a while, not and even before my son's cancer diagnosis. Um, but also, this novel was really inspired by the story of Ethan Linderberger, and he's the young man in Ohio who, when he turned 18, started looking into becoming vaccinated because his mom is an anti-vaxxer and she never had him or his siblings vaccinated. And um, there are different laws regarding minor health care and the decisions that they can make in various states in the US. But apparently he had to wait until he was 18 to make that decision for himself. And he went and got vaccinated against his mother's advice or wishes. And he was a big story in the news at that time. And I was just like, wow, that's really cool. And so what my young adult novel is about is called Stuck. And the main character is Cassidy, and she is a high school student, and she is stuck between her family and her beliefs. And her best friend, Angie, the two of them are in their junior year of high school. They're enjoying their time together, running track, going to parties, having a good time, thinking about college. And then Angie is diagnosed with leukemia. And Cassidy, as her friend, is by her side, um, vows to be with her, support her through this battle. And unknowingly, she is infected with the measles and doesn't realize she's sick, goes and hangs out with Angie in the hospital and infects her immunocompromised friend. And Angie dies. And so Cassidy is devastated, of course, because she believes that she killed her friend, and she decides to try to find a doctor who will vaccinate her, even though her mother does not approve, and even though she is still a minor. She's 16, she's not 18 yet. So that is the story. And my reason for making it a young adult novel is because I would like to try to reach young people with this message that vaccines are safe and effective. Even if you have both of your parents or one parent who disagrees and hasn't vaccinated you or had you vaccinated as you were growing up, it's at some point you're going to be able to make a choice for yourself, whether it's when you're 18 or before you're 18, and they should be informed and they should know, I mean, what the potential outcomes are, because death is a possibility, unfortunately.
So I noticed that Cassidy, as you say, Cassidy is 16, and in the book she goes to get vaccinated, and she can do that because she's old enough. You
No, she
said
can't do it.
Ethan was 18 when.
She
Oh,
cannot.
she
No, but
can't do it.
she was able to convince the doctor to do it.
Oh, that's right, because she had a parental form that had already been
Yeah,
signed. Is
and
that correct?
honestly, this is a work of fiction, Dave, right? I'm not saying that any of this
Yeah.
is accurate. I really don't think that, at least in Texas, that any doctor would treat a minor like that without the explicit consent of their parents. So just in the story, she was able to go find a doctor, and she cried and was emotional and said, I killed my best friend, I don't want to do this to anybody else, please vaccinate me against anything else that I could possibly get and infect somebody with. So
Yeah, that confused me a little because in Australia, the age at which a child can uh, can seek and receive simple medical treatment without the knowledge or consent of their parents
Oh,
is
it
actually
is
14.
throughout
And
the entire
yeah, and
country.
that's
Okay,
across the country.
okay,
Yeah. So I thought it was odd that she was being presented as a minor at the age of 16,
ah,
but that makes sense. That makes sense to
gotcha,
me now.
gotcha.
Of course, in Australia, the age of consent is 16, so below 16 is
Okay,
a minor, and 18 to drink alcohol and get your driver's
so we're
license. So,
16 to get your
um,
driver's license. We're still 21 to drink alcohol.
okay, I think 18 is 16. 16, you can get your learner's
Okay,
license. I think 17 or 18 is when you can get your
gotcha,
provisional license. And by the time you're 18, you've got your
gotcha.
full license. But yeah, so that's what just
Okay.
confused me. So I was wondering about this parental form. I was wondering if that was an actual thing in America, or if that was just a literary device
Yeah,
that
it's
you'd
not a, I don't,
that you'd
it's
made
not a
up to.
thing as far as I know. It
Okay.
was just fiction. It's part of the story.
Yep. It works. It works
Okay.
quite naturally though.
Thanks.
Anyway, and it provides an explanation for that. But yes, now I understand why that is, because you guys have got a higher age
Sure.
for seeing a doctor without
But
consent. Yeah.
it does depend on the state. In the US, I looked into this a little bit and I was surprised to find that, like, I think in Alaska, an 11-year-old can make all medical decisions for themselves. So it just depends on where they are. But in Texas, it is still the age of 18 when you're considered an adult.
So when Cassidy realizes that she has been responsible for her friend's infection, how does that affect her relationship with her friend's family, and how does it affect her relationship with her anti-vax
Hmm.
mother?
That
I already know
I
because I've read the book, but let's give the audience a hint.
I'm glad you read the book. um, she is very worried and very concerned that her friend's parents are going to be furious with her and hate her and blame her because she feels like she's to blame. She feels completely responsible. So why wouldn't her parents? And that she's very saddened by this because she spends so much time at their home growing up and everything. But of course, the parents are rational people and they do not blame her for the death of their daughter. They say, no, you didn't kill her, the cancer did. She had this weakened immune system. It wasn't your fault. And then Cassidy does blame her mother. And she is actually surprised that her mother does not accept responsibility for not having her vaccinated and putting her in this position. And honestly, this might be a bit of a spoiler, but I didn't want to leave it like that. I wanted them to end up having a good relationship. So they were able to work it out. Because I didn't want it to break up the mother-child relationship. And that might be because I'm a mom. I would hate that.
Well, I'm a dad, and I would have either left it as a cliffhanger
Would you?
or a devastating breach, yeah, for the extra drama.
There you go. Well, I tell some people that, in the story, Angie dies, and they're like shocked. They're like, oh, you killed her? I'm like, well, it's real. Yeah, it can happen.
When Cassidy goes to see the doctor, she goes to a local emergency center. I can't remember what they call ER or
It's
something.
it's an
Um,
urgent care center. We have a lot of
Urgent
these
care.
here now. This is something that's fairly new within the last 20 years. They kind of call it a doc in the box. Have you ever heard that term?
No, I
No?
haven't, because
Okay. It's just like
our
a
healthcare
standalone.
system is very
It,
different to yours. So,
yeah, it's completely different. So instead of needing to make an appointment with your primary care physician, your family doctor, or it used to be just doing that or going to the emergency room at the hospital. This is kind of an in-between option where it's certainly not as expensive as going to the ER at the hospital, but still, it's still a doctor. You still get decent care and it's easier to get into, but you don't have the personal connection either. Like I know my doctor knows me. I know my doctor. I go see them at least once a year, maybe twice, but if you need to go and get antibiotics or something, you can just go and they're everywhere. They're
So it's a
all over the
convenient
place.
way to get primary care. The only disadvantage is that you don't have someone who's got your medical background on file, and they
Right.
know. And but
Yeah.
you're not going for that kind of thing anyway. You're just going for a basic service
Most likely. Yeah.
that you can get from anywhere.
It's like Whataburger. They're everywhere.
Yeah. I noticed she has to show insurance as well. Why does she need to show an insurance card for this?
Otherwise, it would be a lot more expensive. They still, um, so if you have health insurance, a lot of times you just have to pay a copay. It's not covered 100%. Just a visit to the doctor is not going to be covered 100%. There's typically a copay of $20, $40, something like that. And yeah, if you have your insurance card, even if this is not your regular doctor, they're going to file it with your insurance and hopefully get paid by your insurance company.
Oh, okay. Right, yeah. Because in Australia we have universal healthcare, so
Yeah,
you just rock up and you don't get a bill because hey, this is a service you've already paid for with your
with your
taxes, so why
taxes.
would you get a bill?
Sure.
So our universal healthcare system is called Medicare, and it is funded by a little charge called the Medicare levy, which is 1.5% or 1.5% of your income once you reach a certain income threshold, and that's all it is.
That doesn't sound like too much, because
I don't think it's too
I'm
much, to be
sure
honest.
I'm
I've
sure that we're going through a lot of these conversations in the States right now, and people think, oh, if we had a universal healthcare system, they were going to take 40% of our paycheck or something, but 1.5% doesn't sound too bad to ensure that everybody has decent medical care and health insurance.
No,
Hmm.
that's we think it's pretty cool. Obviously, if you're a very high income earner, up to a much higher threshold, I think it kicks in somewhere around 110 or maybe a bit further, 100 at least 100,000 anyway. There's an additional 1% called the Medicare levy surcharge. So that just ensures that people who are really at the top end are paying their fair share. But even then, the very most, if you're a very high income earner, the very most you'll be paying is an extra 2.5%.
Hmm.
And I honestly don't think that's a massive
No, it
burden,
doesn't sound like it.
particularly since in Australia, the basic tax-free threshold is $20,000 a year. So your first $20,000 isn't taxed
Hmm.
anyway. And 80% of Australians are on the basic tax rate. They pay no more than about 33 to 35% tax. That's 80% of taxpayers. So I really don't think we're getting screwed out of our salaries here.
Right.
I just don't think
Is it a
that's
flat
a
tax?
big.
Do you have a flat tax?
Oh, no,
No,
no, no. We
okay.
have a sliding
Okay.
scale. We have a sliding scale.
Okay.
It's just that it's the bands are quite broad. So yeah, because 80% of Australians fall below, say you know below, I think around 80 to
Hmm.
$100,000 income or salary, most of us, nearly all of us, are paying a tax, between 33 and
Hmm.
35%, simply because that's the tax band that most of us fall
Right.
into. And of course, if you're earning 80 odd thousand plus, and then say 140,000 plus, then yeah, you are definitely
Hmm.
paying more. 80% of us aren't anywhere near
Okay.
that.
That's
So
interesting.
so the idea that if you have universal health care, you're going to be looking at tax rates of 50, 60, 70, 80%. Well, it's certainly not true in Australia. And what that does mean is that no matter which facility you go to, whether it's a local doctor or a local medical
Mm-hmm.
center or a public hospital, you don't need to worry about insurance because you don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why most Australians, I think more than 50% of Australians haven't bothered to get private health insurance because we don't need
Okay.
it. Not because we can't
Right.
afford it, because our health insurance is much cheaper than yours because the government subsidizes
Mm-hmm.
it for a start. And the government has a website where you can compare all health insurance plans right across the nation available to you because of course health insurance can sell across state lines, there's no restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
and you can simply put in the details that you want for your family and say this is the type of coverage I want, and this government website will provide you with all the available plans across the nation from all the available providers, and you can have a look at one that suits you, and then you can go and contact them and say, yeah, I'd like to sign
Right.
up with you guys. And because by law they are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of pre-existing conditions
Mm-hmm.
or
Yep.
age, they can't
Yeah.
stop you signing up.
I do
They can't
think,
stop you signing up with cheaper or more
right,
expensive insurance,
whatever you want.
whatever you
I
want to
do think
pick.
we need something similar. We need some kind of solution. But the way our two-party system is here, they refuse to work together. So, you know, if another party, is in control, they're just going to try to shut down anything that the previous party did and vice versa. So I'm really not sure how we're going to accomplish anything.
It is a much more complicated issue in the US. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
some countries have had universal health care for a long time. Germany's got one of the oldest universal health care systems. I'm pretty sure that was introduced by Bismarck, yeah, way before even the 30s, before even the
Really?
30s. So Germany's had theirs for a long time. Ours wasn't fully in place until about, I think, late 70s, early to
Oh,
mid
okay.
80s. It was sort of phased in. So again, people can't even say, "Oh, but it's too late to change that." Well, Australia's not a particularly old country. We're only,
Right.
we're even younger than you guys, and we took a long time
Mm-hmm.
to actually implement a full scale universal healthcare system, and we've had ours for less than
Mm-hmm.
50 years, and we still managed to
Right.
get it in. But it all depends on it's about priorities and whether or not the government has the political will
Exactly.
to deal with it.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
know pharmaceuticals in your company in your country are very expensive. In Australia they're very, very cheap, and they're heavily subsidized by the government as well. So the older a medication is, as you know, the cheaper it tends to be because generics can now be made because
Sure.
the patents no longer apply, and the Australian government uses that to its advantage to purchase pharmaceuticals from international companies at greatly reduced prices. It argues
Mm-hmm.
and bargains very aggressively. And although we're only a small country in terms of population, we're only about 25 million. Once other countries see that we've got a good deal, it allows them to place greater pressure on that company to get a good deal for them as well. And that's
Right.
particularly the case with countries that have universal healthcare. So in Australia, we have something called the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, which ensures that a huge range of pharmaceuticals are so heavily subsidized that for most of them, the maximum that you will pay for a prescription is about, $41, regardless of the medication.
Wow. There
So
are
insulin,
people die because they can't afford their insulin here
yeah, well,
and
insulin
they're
is
diabetics.
cheaper. When I looked at the prices of insulin in the US, it just made my eyes water. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
diabetic. No one in my family is, but I know
Yeah.
I've got friends who are diabetic.
Yeah.
So the
Sure. Me
cost of
too.
insulin was quite stunning to me because that is a basic requirement. It's not exactly a luxury drug.
No, it's
It is
not.
an
It's not an
essential
elective.
drug that people need to get through the day.
There was
So
another story a few years ago where there was a young man, and he happened to be in Minneapolis, and he was a diabetic, and he was working, but he didn't have insurance, and he didn't want to bother his mother with the cost of his insulin. And I think he started diluting it somehow, but he died. The kid died. He was in his early 20s. And that's just ridiculous. That should not be happening.
No, no, I think in an advanced first world nation with a crazy amount of money, which the
Mm-hmm.
US certainly is,
Mm-hmm.
and that pretty much applies to all the leading developed nations, and even Australia's in that because we're quite affluent as well. That's really not something that's
Right. I
excusable,
agree.
to be honest.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, in Australia, if you want to buy private health insurance, you
Mm-hmm.
can, but there is no requirement to do so. There's no government mandate saying that you have to. Not only that, but if you do buy private health insurance, you can still use the public system as much as you like with no penalty
Yeah.
whatsoever. There is a small rebate on health insurance premiums if you choose to buy them. But even with that, because competition is so strongly encouraged, and there's no restrictions with selling insurance across state lines, for example, and because the
Mm-hmm.
public system is so popular, health insurance companies have to compete very aggressively with each other in order to win customers. So there is no room for them to inflate prices or to try and exclude certain types of patients. The law doesn't allow it,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't make sense
It doesn't make
anyway.
financial sense for them,
No,
right?
when
Yeah.
you've got a population, most of whom are using the public system because it's so good and it's basically free,
Sure.
then you can't afford to say, well, our insurance premiums are $6,000 a month, kind of thing. I mean,
Right.
yeah, it's just we don't have private health insurance for the moment.
Yeah.
We don't
Well,
really need it. We haven't,
well,
and even if we had to get psychiatric treatment under our healthcare system, you're entitled to 10 free psychiatric visits a year. So, and for a lot of people, that works out pretty well. You could basically see a
right.
psychiatrist or a psychologist almost once a month for a year, free of charge, which is pretty good. So
Mm-hmm.
the provisions are there if you need them.
No, but mental health is just as important as physical health, in my opinion. And we need to have a system here where that is appreciated, and that is that mental health patients are cared for just as much as physical health. So, yeah, I would like to
And
have
now I'm
a
not I'm not saying the Australian system is perfect. I mean, some of the European systems are really, really good. France, for example, is widely recognized as having one of the best healthcare systems in the world.
okay.
The Australian system definitely needs some improvement, and there's been a lot of talk about funding and allocation of funds to hospitals and this kind of thing. But given a choice between our system and say the US system, I would certainly prefer our
Yeah,
system. I'm
I don't
pretty
blame you.
pretty happy with it.
It sounds
It'll
pretty
work for
good.
us.
Yeah,
So this has been a big
I know.
sidetrack, but it's been good to
It
talk
is good
about
to
because
talk
I think
about because I don't know what your system is
because
like, and I
that's it.
don't know
I've
what
only
you
got a
hear
basic
about.
understanding of the American
Yeah,
system, but it helps because this all ties into the issues that you're dealing with here. The cost of
sure.
treatment for something like leukemia or the
Oh, and I know families who have been broken financially because of their child's cancer treatment. I know that. And I mean, we were very lucky that the health insurance that we had, we were able to pay for anything out of pocket fairly easily, and it didn't break us financially. It's very sad for some of these. There was so when Brendan had his stem cell transplant last year, there were other families in the transplant ward, of course, and I got to know some of the other parents there. I'm very lucky also. I've got a full-time job as a technical writer, and I was able to do my work there in the hospital. My employer was really great about letting me take the time off that I needed, and also being very flexible where I was able to work either at home or in the hospital. So I'm very grateful for that as well. But there were moms there who they had to be somewhere in order to work. And one of them came from out of state, another one came from East Texas, which was very far away. It's not a drive that you can make easily. She was living in the hospital, so they were not able to work. I mean, that's when things get really tough.
that is it. It's it's a pretty brutal situation when the support simply isn't available from the insurance company because you either can't afford it
Hmm.
or they found sufficient exceptions to exclude you from the service you thought you were going to be able to get from them. Whereas on the other hand, the level of government support is so low that it either doesn't help you very much or it doesn't apply to your situation or it's inaccessible for whatever reason or there's just so much paperwork to get through it would
Yeah.
take you so long to qualify and go through all the hoops that your your family member could be even sicker
Hmm.
good or could even be on the verge of death by that stage because the bureaucracy takes so long, and a lot of people simply do not have the luxury of time, especially with a late diagnosis or an
Right.
unexpected diagnosis
Right.
or a
Right.
very rapid onset
Yeah.
cancer that
Yeah.
moves very quickly. In Australia, we've got a bit of a dark joke that our healthcare system is called Medicare, and in America, it's called GoFundMe.
It's
And
true. Oh my gosh, it's so
um,
true.
I
Everybody who has a disease or cancer or something, you see GoFundMe everywhere. Oh my gosh, that's funny that you say that.
yeah, I was quite stunned. When I first heard that, I thought, oh yeah, I know what they're referring to, but surely it's not quite that bad. Then I started
It is.
reading online. I thought,
Yeah,
oh, it
it
is
is.
actually that. If anything, it's worse. So yeah, that was a bit of an eye opener.
Oh my gosh.
Um, so yeah, I've it's been really interesting to discuss and see discuss these issues and see how it plays into your story. You don't actually go into costs really in the story, and I'm assuming from the way you've written it that the family has the capacity to meet their care costs. I don't recall any big discussions about
There was one part where
um,
one of the high school friends did start a GoFundMe,
oh,
and
she gets $10,000 from the GoFundMe.
that's
That's right. Yeah.
right.
Um, so yeah, there was that in, and I thought, oh yeah, there's your GoFundMe. um, I didn't get the impression that the family was in great hardship, but it was nice to see that. But yeah, it is a reminder that this kind of condition and this kind of treatment is still prohibitively expensive for a lot of
Right,
people, and even
right.
a family that's quite comfortably well off is going to need a bit of an extra bump in finances and a
Sure.
bit of a leg up to meet some of these
Especially if
costs
they've got
because
if
there's
they're a
so
two
exorbitant.
income family, they're especially if they're a two income family and they're used to having those two incomes. So who's to say if they can manage on one income alone or not? That's
Well, that's it. People say, "Oh, but you're a two income family." Well, what if one of the people who's producing an income is one of the people who's sick? I mean, that's
right.
that when your entire budget is carefully balanced around the fact that you've got two incomes,
That's
suddenly
right.
dropping down to one is utterly catastrophic. So,
Yeah.
so yeah. Although I do remember the GoFundMe. It was yeah, that was in passing. I don't think you mentioned specifically the cost of treatment though as a
I did
big
not. No.
issue for the family.
Right.
But it was nice to have that little reminder in there to say, look, this is a very real issue that people face, and they just have to rely on the strength of the community and the willingness of local people
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
help them out.
Yeah. Exactly.
And a lot
Exactly.
of people sadly simply do not have that luxury, which is why I think in the US, I think church communities have been very good from what I've seen. A lot of church communities have been very good at
Yes.
meeting this need, which is great because certainly
Yes.
that's the kind of thing churches should be doing anyway.
Should be doing.
But it's,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
but it is pretty, at the same time, it's quite an indictment of the system that this has to be done.
Yes, I
So
agree. I agree.
So wrapping up then, what would you like people to take away from your book? What would you like them
Well,
to be left with? What's the message, the main message you want to get across?
so I guess my message, excuse me, or my call to action is really for younger people. So for teenagers and young adults who are interested in reading this story, I compare this novel to like a John Green novel, The Fault in Our Stars, Turtles All the Way Down. There's also another uh, teen health book called 5 Feet Apart. Fans of those types of books are going to enjoy Stuck, I believe. But there's also the message that I want young people to come away with, that even if you're hearing from people in your family or in your circle that vaccines are dangerous, take some time to talk to your own doctor. Go look at scientific publications. Go look at, real evidence. Because vaccines are truly life-saving, and it can be very, very harmful for a lot of people if too many people don't vaccinate their children, and there are these outbreaks again of, like we were saying, that hasn't been seen in so many years, polio and pertussis, and the measles, unfortunately, which are coming back. And it's just not necessary. It really isn't necessary.
That's certainly a really great message, and definitely one that we need more than ever in these recent times, with the huge amount of uncertainty about the pandemic and
Yeah.
the the paranoia that's starting to build up about vaccines and about big pharma and medicine and the medical industry in general. And it's a very sad thing to see at a time when we need science and medicine more than ever.
And I
Well,
used an
uh,
analogy in the book about how people love their cell phones, right? And people are all about the advancement of technology, and they want to get the latest and greatest cell phone, and they can't wait to get these new devices in their hands. You know, medical advancement is the same thing. It is simply the advancement of medical technology as opposed to electronic technology. And I don't understand why people have such a hard time with that. It's it's the same thing.
yeah, I think that's a good point. It's there's still a lot of old myths that began with the advent of vaccination and the anti-vax community that sprang up immediately against it.
Sure.
There's a lot of those old myths haven't actually died. They've simply morphed into different shapes. I mean, Edward Jenner gave us vaccination, and an anti-vax community sprang up immediately
Yeah.
to oppose his smallpox vaccine. And some of the, arguments and claims being made mirror those that are still being made today, even
Mm.
though they are no more reliable or coherent or credible than they were back in the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay. Well,
so,
I
yeah,
enjoyed your interview with Dr. Anna the other day. I've been a fan of hers for a while. And she said that, and I think this is absolutely true, there's always been the village nutter or the village idiot, right? But with social media, it's so easy for them to find like-minded people, and they find their tribe. And then you talked about the Facebook algorithms that only spit out the stuff that you want to see, right? So you're being conditioned to think that, oh, I'm right because all these other people think the way I do. So it's just, social media has really created a quite a storm of the anti-vaxxers, I think.
yeah, because social media is programmed to show you what you want to see.
Yeah,
It's not programmed to show you the truth. So it doesn't take long to be sucked into
right.
a little echo chamber, and then after a while, all you're ever seeing is more material from that echo chamber or from similar echo chambers, which simply repeat the same mantras.
Right.
Yeah, I did thoroughly enjoy my interview with Dr. Anna. She is a towering intellect
Yes.
and an extremely experienced scientist. And I, like you, I've been following her for some time. In fact, I've been following her for a few years now.
Me
And
too. Yeah.
yeah, she's one of my big top shelf science crushes
Hmm.
for sure. She's really impressive
I
and
agree.
very easy to talk to. Great sense of humor
Hmm.
and a terrific personality.
Hmm.
So if people want to buy your book, and honestly, why wouldn't they? Where
Why
can
not?
they find it?
Well, it's on Amazon right now. I am a big fan of supporting local bookstores, so I'm working on making it available to the smaller local independent bookstores as well. But right now, it's available on Amazon. So hopefully, in the near future, it'll be more widely available.
So that is Stuck by Diane Windsor, and it's available on Amazon. That's really terrific. Well, thank you so much for giving me your time this morning. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, maybe we'll speak again sometime. Maybe we'll have another. You'll have another book out,
I would
but
love it. I'd love to talk to you again, Dave. This is great.
yeah, that would be really terrific. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.